You clicked on this video because you think that the world is collapsing, or will collapse anytime soon. And you know what? I'm not blaming you. Countries are directly at war, and there are rising tensions in the Middle East. So what if absolutely everything went wrong? By the end of the video, I will cover the point of divergence, a potential third world war, nuclear war, radiation, and nuclear winter. This is how the world would collapse in the next 20 years, if we are not careful. This video is not realistic. This is just the worst that can happen. I want to address the elections this November in the United States of America, which is the world's largest economy and military. Right now, 6 months before the election, according to all sources, Trump is predicted to win over Joe Biden. The reality is that no matter which candidate wins, there is going to be tens of millions of people who are going to get upset, call it a fake vote, and maybe even turn violent. While a civil war is not possible right now, America is growing more divided every day. I mentioned violence, and I think that this is how 2025 would start. To understand the future, we must investigate the past. Let me briefly tell you what happened in the last election, so you can understand why the election in 2024 would be even more violent than last time. The last election of the United States was in 2020, and Trump lost by 8.4%, and generally, Joe Biden was always in the lead on the national level. I'm telling you all of this because despite Trump losing by a lot, on the 6th of January, his supporters occupied the Capitol building. This happened because these people didn't recognize Joe Biden as winning the election fairly. They hoped to keep Donald Trump in power and prevent a joint session of Congress counting the Electoral College votes to formalize the victory of President-elect Joe Biden. This election of 2024 has the potential to go even more violent. Trump and Biden are getting a rematch, and Donald Trump is the more likely candidate to win this time. The problem is that it's going to be a very close election. 6 months before the election, the website 538.com has gathered data to show that Trump is leading by about 1% over Joe Biden. You can see just how close this election is, and now let me show you the results of last time. If this caused a riot in the United States, I cannot think what would happen if such an election as the one in 2024 would cause. No matter which side wins, tens of millions would oppose it. Again, I don't claim a civil war would happen, but there is going to be plenty of unrest. This is important as the world would see the weakness of the strongest economy and military. As a result, some new wars may pop up due to the world's police, which is the United States of America, being busy dealing with itself. As a result, Ukraine and Israel would temporarily lose their biggest supporter. Ukraine is right now losing ground against Russia, so this can even worsen in the Donbass region. Israel is slowly advancing, but they are losing international support due to their actions in Gaza. If Donald Trump comes out on top as the American president, we can assume that the world is going to take a different turn. I will take his words of him wanting to stop all these wars. The problem is that the United States cannot project its power as much without risking a civil war with such a divided society and close elections. To solve the conflict in Israel, I would assume that Trump would propose for Israel to get rid of Hamas, but not annex Gaza. Israel would have to give Gaza's needed supplies, electricity and water, even after the war. To achieve this, Trump would give Israel anything that they need so they can hunt down Hamas. The Palestinian people in Gaza would see Trump's victory as their victory, since it would result in them finally get water and electricity independently from Israel. While this can end one conflict, although there is still some tension, this I think is all that Trump could achieve. The conflict in Ukraine is unlikely to end. Trump can try its hardest to negotiate a peace deal, but nothing would happen. This is because Ukraine, as of now, is not willing to lose anything, not even recognize Crimea as Russian and join NATO after that. Trump and Putin will negotiate over Ukraine, and the deal that they might agree to is for Putin to take the 4 oblasts that he annexed via an unfair referendum, which are the Donbass, Kharkiv and Zaporizhia, and the rest of Ukraine to join NATO. As I said earlier, Ukraine is not even willing to recognize Crimea as Russian, if it meant that this would end the conflict. As of now, Ukraine wants total victory, so any peace is impossible to happen. Peace in Ukraine is not possible according to my information. Trump would promise that he would end all wars, and while he would see some success, he still would lose the trust of his voters. The next elections of the United States I cannot predict, but the Republican Party is unlikely to win again. While all of this was happening, China would be up in flames. Due to economic stagnation, the country would experience a lot of unrest from its younger population. This is because the Chinese Communist Party made an informal deal with the people, where the people exchanged their freedom for economic prosperity. The CCP mostly kept up their word, as China experienced the largest growth in human history, but not by the Great Leap Forward, ironically enough. The young Chinese would rebel because there is practically not a lot of room for China's economy to grow, and the party is increasing its grip on controlling the people via the social credit system. The Chinese Communist Party can no longer offer people economic growth in exchange for unlimited authority. As a result, for many young Chinese people, this would be their final chance to secure themselves a bright future. News of this wouldn't reach the West, as China is good at censoring information, but this would impact the whole world. The Chinese economy is already running very thin, as it relies on real estate, which is no longer profitable in China. As a result of the young Chinese rebelling and not going to work, it's fair to say that the Chinese economy would crash. And considering that the country is the world's factory, the whole world would actually feel this crash. As a result, many poorer and vulnerable countries would be the first ones to suffer any hardships, and there isn't going to be anyone to save them. I cannot cover the whole world, but I will only cover the countries that are in NATO, as this is important for the war that would happen in a couple of minutes in this video. Eastern Europe is suffering from a population collapse, where not only the fertility rates are down, but people are also leaving these countries en masse. To add insult to injury, this region is the poorest in Europe, and they cannot buy cheap Chinese goods, so the cost of living would skyrocket. Bulgaria is my home country, and the future for them isn't looking too bright at all. I may be biased, but I think that it would be among the first countries in Europe to collapse. The government would be running on a deficit and cut spending on welfare, which would radicalize the elderly Bulgarians. As a result, young people would leave as the government would most likely increase taxes drastically. So there is going to be few younger people that would have to support an aging population. This would result in the retirement age to increase and for wages to go down. As a result, people from Eastern Europe in general are more likely to move out and go to Western Europe. I cannot tell you how the collapse of Bulgaria would look like and who will fill the power vacuum. But what is important is that the country cannot function as a NATO member. France would also have it very rough, as they are already spending a lot on welfare and have insanely high taxes. While France and other Western European countries can deal with the Chinese economic collapse more effectively, there is just one single problem. This is that the people from Eastern Europe are going to move out and go to Western Europe, so this would drive rent prices in Western Europe, meanwhile decreasing the working wage, as people from Eastern Europe are willing to work for cheaper. France, I think, is the most vulnerable country in Western Europe to suffer a revolution, where something drastic would need to happen in order to resolve this issue. I once heard what he thought he is to compare Europe's future to the revolutions of 1848, and I think that he is spot on. I cannot cover it in detail, but the long story short is that Europe would be in flames and that the governments would be collapsing. This is important as most of Europe is in NATO, so these countries cannot fight wars effectively if something were to happen. We can see some countries withdraw from NATO and choose to focus on their own domestic issues. As a result, Ukraine may be defeated and sign a humiliating peace treaty, due to the lack of support from NATO members, but I cannot predict that for certain. It's actually not important for the scenario whether Ukraine loses or not, but this is a detail worth mentioning. I'll let you make up your own opinion. As for outside of Europe, historically, all dictatorial countries would be in danger, as their populations can turn against the ruling party, with the hopes of freedom and better lives. Countries like Cuba, Venezuela, Belarus and Russia, just to name a few, would suffer from a lot of protests. Historically, when a dictator is on the verge of losing power, a war is started as to distract the country from the worsening economic situation. China and Russia are two countries that could be considered modern dictatorships, so you can see how the problem would escalate. China, being the center of the crisis, would have to do something daring. The Chinese Communist Party would collapse if they sit idle and do nothing, as a result of millions of people disliking the regime. As I said earlier, the communists in China were allowed undisputed power in exchange for economic prosperity. So if China were to become economically prosperous again, the CCP would remain in power. Considering that situation, I think that the only way to do that is for China to invade Taiwan, as they would seize a country of about 25 million people, with a developed microprocessor and other chip manufacturing sectors. Even if China were to annex Taiwan without a fight and incorporate all of these people without any resistance, this would do little to offset the failing Chinese economy. Having said all of this, it may be China's only option for survival. I would say that in this situation, the Chinese Communist Party would invade Taiwan. Japan and South Korea are key allies of Taiwan, who also suffer from collapsing birth rates. If Japan and South Korea do not defend Taiwan right now, these two countries may disappear in the coming years, as their population is expected to halve by 2025. The Philippines is also likely to join in the defense of Taiwan, but this is very much dependent if the United States of America is to join or not. As I said earlier, due to Trump's failure to make peace in Ukraine, by that alternate war, we would have a Democrat candidate as the President of the United States. I'm no expert in US politics, but I would say that the Democrats aren't as much pro-war as the Republicans. Joe Biden has said that the United States would defend Taiwan, so I don't doubt that the United States would join the war, no matter if there is a Republican or a Democrat president. The problem is that the liberal Democrats are against war, as they protested the United States sending weapons to Ukraine and helping secure Israel's borders. Still, despite all this disunity, this may be the thing that would unite the United States of America, no pun intended. I may be wrong about some of the stuff that I said, but the narrative of the video doesn't change. This is because I believe the war would escalate, maybe even becoming nuclear. North Korea would join as they would really want to unite all of Korea under the communist ideology. While Russia is the aggressive power according to many people, I don't think that they would do much in this scenario. This is because they had just secured peace in Ukraine, according to my scenario. The Russian army would be depleted, and while this war and the collapse of NATO and Eastern Europe is literally the best thing that could happen for Russian expansion, the country cannot capitalize on this opportunity according to my assumptions. Russia and Belarus can unite after the death of Lukashenko, as to deal with the protesters against the dictatorial rule in both countries more effectively. This is the only Russian expansion I would give them. Before the war goes nuclear, I want to mention how devastating this would be. The fact is that modern airplanes and aircraft carriers are really powerful, but there isn't a large quantity of them. Watchfulhist made a good point in one of his videos that in such a war, all of this advanced equipment would quickly become destroyed in the World War. As a result, the Third World War would be fought with cold era equipment. As for how the conflict would go nuclear, I don't think that China would be the initiator of the nuclear war, as they have said that they would never strike first, and I would actually believe them. This is because China doesn't benefit from striking first. Even if they nuke the largest city in the United States, which is New York City with 8.3 million people, the United States would retaliate and nuke Shanghai, which has 4 times the population. China has more dense population, so a nuclear war wouldn't go in their favor. According to my assumptions, Russia would for now stay out of the conflict, unless they are very crazy. China doesn't have a lot of nuclear weapons, at least compared to the United States, as this graph visualizes. This is why I think that China would not strike first. The United States can also not strike first out of the belief that they can win the war conventionally, and also because of moral reasons. The only nuclear power remaining who would get involved in this war is North Korea, and I think that they are the most likely candidate to do that. Since South Korea has the more superior technology, the North Koreans can be pushed back, and out of desperation, Seoul, a city of almost 10 million people, would be nuked. This scenario I will not cover, as there is more likely option for a nuclear war to start, and this is by accident. Right now, there is an agreement between all the nuclear countries to notify each other when they are doing nuclear tests or launching rockets into space. While this may seem strange, even Russia during their invasion of Ukraine has notified the West if they are going to launch any rockets into space. The reason for that is that this would prevent a huge misunderstanding. If a country launches a rocket without notifying the other countries, there is no way for these countries to know if this rocket is moving towards them, or if it just carries any nuclear material. This is important as the United States has a policy of launch on warning. This means that if there are nukes flying towards the United States, the country will not wait for them to land and then to send their own nukes, but quite the opposite. The logic behind that is that if the United States gets nuked first, there isn't going to be a possibility to respond back, hence why they would launch on warning. As a result, I think that it's entirely possible that China and the United States would notify each other if they will launch any rockets into space, or do some sorts of nuclear tests, despite the two countries being at war. I learned all this information from this podcast, where they also discussed the entire process of the United States launching a nuke, as well as the policy of the president being the only person who can launch these weapons. Earlier I mentioned that North Korea is the largest problem, and this is because they are the only nuclear power who doesn't notify other countries when they conduct their tests. As of today, North Korea violates this about 1 time per week on average, so each week the United States doesn't know if these nukes are flying straight towards them, they just know that North Korea has launched a rocket somewhere. This is how I think the scenario would escalate in a realistic way. North Korea would simply launch some rockets for whatever reason, without notifying the United States. Considering that the countries are at war, the United States can assume that these rockets have nuclear warheads and that they are flying straight towards them. As a result, they would launch on warning. Again, in a hypothetical situation, if these rockets hit the US nuclear silos and destroy them, the United States cannot respond with nuclear weapons of their own, so they would have to use them before impact. The United States would also start sending nukes to China and North Korea, who would send theirs back, together to South Korea and Japan. Even if there is a war between Europe and Russia, it wouldn't matter for this scenario, as soon the whole world would become nuclear wasteland. When these nuclear weapons hit, the war would stop immediately. Both sides would have to reconcile and recover the survivors of their population. Such a devastating war can take the lives of up to 5 billion people. Considering that the world's population is 8 billion, this is a large percentage. The death toll of 5 billion people doesn't come of the war itself, as in total about 2 billion people would have been involved. It would happen as a result of nuclear winter, which would kill many crops, and the dust would block the sun up to 80%. This would affect countries that had nothing to do with the conflict, so the entire northern hemisphere could really collapse. This is because all the countries with nuclear weapons are located in the northern hemisphere. As a result of this nuclear winter, the Mediterranean Sea could actually freeze, and the breadbasket of Europe, which is Ukraine, could see its rivers also freeze. The Nordic countries are already cold, but it's going to get even worse for them. As a result, all of Europe would experience extreme food shortages. Dying quickly to a nuclear weapon would be what many people would have wished for, rather than having to suffer the long death of starving and freezing. Australia, parts of Africa and Argentina I think will emerge on top of this conflict. Australia could participate in the war against China and get nuked, so they're not guaranteed. Africa is pretty much isolated from the Americas and Asia, where the conflict would be happening, so the whole continent can come out on top and become the strongest region in the world after the war. This video is not meant to be an accurate prediction of future world events, but I want to raise awareness of these issues and how quickly everything could collapse. This is considering that everything takes turn for the worst, which very well might not happen. As a result, it may make sense that in a potential Chinese collapse that the United States would actually help their rival, as if China is on the verge of collapse, scary stuff would happen. To transition to something positive, I want to challenge you to a game of rock paper scissors. Click on the screen on what you would like to choose and let's see if you would win. Good luck and I hope to see you there.